It's no secret that some of the most iconic events and showdowns from any Koei Musou game is showcased in the Samurai Warriors series. Whether it's Tadakatsu's stand at Sekigahara or Nobunaga's betrayal at the Honnoji Temple, there are so many pivotal conflicts here that stand out as defining moments for some of our favourite characters. One such defining moment from the Sengoku period is the showdown at Sekigahara. Arguably one of the largest and most important conflicts from this era, the Battle of Sekigahara is a clash between two major forces following the death of Hideyoshi Toyotomi. Those forces were the Western Army led by Mitsunari Ishida and the Eastern Army led by Ieyasu Tokugawa. Now, historically speaking, the Tokugawa forces achieved victory from this conflict, with Ieyasu establishing himself as the most powerful figure in the land. But in today's video, I wanted to revisit the depiction of the Battle of Sekigahara, that being from Samurai Warriors 2 through 4, to see which game did the best job at portraying this event. But why stop there? On top of revisiting the battle from each of the Samurai Warriors games, I'm also going to play through each iteration from both Mitsunari's perspective as well as Ieyasu's. So to spice things up, I've split this project into a two-part series, with today's video focusing on the Western Army's perspective, and with part 2 focusing on the East, which will be available to the public this Friday. Now, with that being said, if you're interested in checking out the Eastern Army's version earlier, it's actually available right now for Koei Collection channel members. If you're interested in becoming a channel member for as little as 99 cents per month, I'll leave a link below in the description. Now, before we dive into Samurai Warriors 2, just a quick bit of housekeeping. Typically in these challenge style of videos, I'll be going up against a boss type figure from the Musou series and ranking each encounter from easiest to hardest. However, in these Sekigahara videos, I wouldn't exactly consider this conflict as having a boss battle, or at least a challenging encounter similar to that of Lu Bu or Zhang Liao. So because of this, I'm more just going to be focusing on determining which event was portrayed the best, in a very similar fashion to the Honnoji video that we did a little while ago. And rather than going through a ranking at the end of each video this time around, I'm more just going to be going through my general thoughts and reflections, with the overall winner being declared at the end of part 2 for which game and which force had the best depiction. And lastly, as always, this is just purely based on my personal opinion, and there's a good chance that we're not going to agree on every thought and reflection we make in this project. So, for example, going into this, I can easily say that my go-to faction for this conflict is the Western Army. I just prefer the Western Army officers overall, and I just like the theme of standing one's ground in defiance of an insurmountable force. I just think it's cool as shit. But if you do disagree or have anything you'd like to add to this project, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. With all of that preamble out of the way, let's finally dive into the first game of today's video with our main man, Mitsunari. When I went back and replayed the Battle of Sekigahara from Samurai Warriors 2, I was surprised by how grounded Mitsunari's motivations felt in this version. Rather than being purely about continuing Hideyoshi's legacy or standing as a foil to Ieyasu, this take on Mitsunari had a much more personal tone, one focused on friendship, loyalty, and protecting those close to him. Right from the outset, there's something iconic about this map. The soundtrack, the layout, the pacing, it all felt deeply familiar and instantly threw me back to some of the first times I played on this chaotic battlefield. Once the mission started, it didn't waste any time ramping up the pressure. I was thrown straight into this tug-of-war scenario with multiple objectives lighting up across the battlefield, and my first priority was to disable the Eastern Army's cannons. They were bombarding our front lines, and if I didn't move quickly, our force would just start dropping like flies. While I was darting around the center trying to capture these cannon positions, enemy officers would just start pouring in from everywhere, pulling my attention in pretty much every direction. And just as I thought that I was making some progress, Ieyasu deployed one of his troops to sway Hideaki Kobayakawa into defecting. That meant sprinting all the way over to the southeast corner of the map to try and intercept him before he could talk Hideaki over to the other side. But unfortunately, just as I managed to reach that section of the map, Hanzo Hattori entered the battlefield, sent by Ieyasu to finish the job. Now, I don't know if it's scripted or if I just wasn't fast enough, but not long after Hanzo arrived, the Mori clan defected over to the Tokugawa side anyway. I felt like that moment was just really genuinely frustrating. It added another wave of pressure just when I thought I was back in control. But moving along, after dealing with that mess, I had to rush back to the center of the map to stabilize the line. And then not long after that, a surprise attack hit our main camp from the west, led by Ina. So now I was forced to make yet another decision. Do I head back to defend the center of the battlefield, or risk everything to protect the main camp? The constant pressure in this battle just didn't let up once, and at every stage it felt like the Western army was constantly on the defensive, always scrambling to regain control rather than dictating the pace. But in a strange way, that's also kind of what made this feel so memorable to me. It was relentless but tightly structured. Visually, the battlefield really isn't as much to look at by today's standards, but there's still just some kind of nostalgic charm to it. And as for its core gameplay, Samurai Warriors 2 still holds up surprisingly well. The movement feels sharp, and the combat, while simple by modern standards, is satisfying. Also, Mitsunari's betrayal here is definitely worth noting. I remembered him being a little bit more cold and ruthless, but this version was actually genuinely selfless and noble. It caught me off guard, but in a good way. I'm not sure if I just misremembered his earlier appearances, or if Koei was still in the process of just trying to figure his character out back then. But eventually, I crossed blades with Ieyasu, which brought the narrative full circle. Mitsunari referenced his friends again, and Ieyasu even acknowledged that Mitsunari was choosing to fight for the people rather than reason. It wasn't really a lengthy exchange, but it did capture their philosophical divide quite nicely, I think. And after Ieyasu fell, the battle ended without too much extra fanfare. Mitsunari rallied his men with a speech that felt a little performative, like he was trying to mimic Hideyoshi's style in a way of trying to rouse the crowd, but it did feel intentional. He even commented at one point that it's those kind of words that made him believe in the first place. And yeah, it was just a really nice moment. But all in all, this version of Sekigahara was far more structured and compelling than I remembered, and it served as a solid foundation for what was to come. When booting up the Sekigahara battle in Samurai Warriors 3, the design philosophy was instantly noticeable. Compared to the tight, center-focused chaos of the previous game, this battlefield was far more spread out. Officers weren't clustered in the middle, but intentionally scattered across distant points, constantly dragging you from one end of the map to the other. But the biggest change by far was the implementation of the fog mechanic, and I honestly loved this addition. It completely changed how the battle played out. Technically, fog existed in the previous version too, but this time around it had a real mechanical purpose. It directly affected your minimap visibility. For a huge chunk of the battle too, I couldn't see anything clearly. Objectives were popping up all over the place, but without the minimap, I was flying blind. It created some genuinely tense moments, especially when I started hearing allied officers calling for help, only to realize that I had no idea where they were. And that is where the fire pillars come in. So the fire pillars are also scattered throughout the battlefield, each one guarded by an enemy officer, and upon defeating the enemy officer, it will actually allow you to light the pillar, which in turn cleared the fog in that region of the map. Again, I just think that this is such a creative and satisfying feature that they implemented into this game. And more than once, I found myself having to choose between following urgent objectives or going out of my way to light another pillar to help my army's awareness. And I think that kind of decision making added another layer of strategy that I didn't expect from a Warriors title. In terms of tone, this battle felt far more desperate than the last. The Western army genuinely felt like the underdog this time around. Officers like Ginchio and Sakon kept emphasizing how impenetrable the Tokugawa defenses were, which really helped sell the mood, I think. Defections also made a return in this version as well, though they were handled a little bit differently. Hideaki Kobayakawa's unit flipped sides almost immediately at the start of the battle. There was no long, drawn-out lead-up like Samurai Warriors 2, just straight-up betrayal. Meanwhile, Hiriori Kakawa turned against Hiramoto Mori rather than both of them defecting together. However, one of the biggest narrative shifts that was included in this version of the Battle of Sekigahara was the inclusion of Kiyomasa Kato. So his presence actually changed the battle's focus from being strictly between Mitsunari and Ieyasu to being more of a personal feud between Mitsunari and Kiyomasa. It reframed the whole conflict as a clash between the Toyotomi loyalists and those who had already accepted the Tokugawa's rise. Now, I do prefer when this battle feels more centered on Mitsunari versus Ieyasu, since their ideological clash is what defines Sekigahara for me, But I didn't mind this approach. It felt like a natural expansion, especially considering Kiyamasa's past with Mitsunari. And interestingly, Ieyasu himself didn't actually have a huge presence on the battlefield. He felt more like a looming figure in the background, more of a symbol rather than like an active participant. But when he did speak, it came across very differently than what it did in Samurai Warriors 2. Here, he was more measured, he was more compassionate. There was really no villainy at all to his words. He was just a leader trying to move forward. When the battle ended, it wasn't with the final duel between Mitsunari and Ieyasu, but rather with Mitsunari facing off against Kiyomasa. It worked well in this context, since their tension had been building up throughout the whole battle, and the post-battle cutscene featured just the two of them standing in the aftermath. It reinforced that this conflict was more personal than political this time around. So, overall, this version of Sekigahara really impressed me. The fog mechanics added meaningfully to the gameplay, and the pace was intense and consistent. And despite shifting the focus and tone ever so slightly, it still captured the Western Army's desperation and resolve. With heading into Samurai Warriors 4, my feelings are a lot more mixed. There's so much about this version of the Sekigahara that works incredibly well, and just as much that feels like a step backwards. Let's start off with what this game gets right, because there is a lot. For one, the story setup here is probably the best so far. The cinematic showing Hideyoshi's death is handled with real care, and it uses the moment to show just how differently Mitsunari and Ieyasu processes grief. At first, Mitsunari comes off as cold and detached, which throws the other officers like Kiyomasa and Masanori off, but by the end of the cutscene, we see that Mitsunari is grieving, and he's channeling all of his energy into planning. He wants to protect what Hideyoshi has built. Meanwhile, Yoshitsugu's line about Ieyasu crying today but changing tomorrow was a standout for me. It perfectly framed the idea that these two men are ideological opposites, even though their motivations come from the exact same place. The pre-battle cutscenes also help flesh things out. Mitsunari pleaded for support, while Yoshitsugu reminded him of the odds. We also got a little bit of world context as well, like the Uesugi and the Sanada forces trying to hold off the Tokugawa reinforcements at Ueda Castle, and it helped make this conflict feel like a part of a much larger war. Then there's Mitsunari's speech to his troops, and it's easily the most cinematic and dramatic moment of any version so far. As a character, this is the strongest that we've seen Mitsunari. But unfortunately, when the battle actually began, that momentum didn't quite carry through. So, Samurai Warriors 4 looks stunning, no one's debating that. The combat is smooth, it's fast, it's satisfying, but the Sekigahara stage itself felt incredibly generic. Of course, there are some really cool visual elements like the palisades and the small fortresses, but in terms of gameplay, nothing really stood out. There's no unique mechanics or systems tied to the map outside of the occasional cannon fire, and compared to the fire pillars and the fog of Samurai Warriors 3, it just felt like a missed opportunity. Even worse, the mission structure was painfully rigid. Everything was scripted. You couldn't go anywhere or do anything until the game allowed you to. And it felt less like a battle and more like moving through a checklist. And I know that Warriors games have always had mission triggers, but this time it was especially noticeable. The map design, where areas are just boxes connected by corridors, only made that problem feel worse. And at times, I couldn't even tell which events I could influence. Could I save Yoshitsugu? Could I prevent a defection? Or were they all just predetermined? The lack of player agency really broke this immersion for me. And I've got to say, the UI didn't help either. Between the flood of on-screen text, flashy effects, and constant movement, I had a really hard time staying focused. I was more tuned into the combat rather than the actual mission itself, which isn't ideal for a story this big. And the difficulty also felt non-existent. I actually failed my first attempt at this stage, because a random enemy just slipped into the main camp while I was mopping up the rest of the map. But on the second try, I beat it so easily. But then, the ending actually really threw me off. You never actually face Ieyasu. Instead, he summons Tadakatsu Honda, and defeating him ends the battle. So, needless to say, it felt really anticlimactic. The post-battle cutscene does redeem things a little bit though. It shows Sakon's last stand and Mitsunari's retreat, and Ieyasu even praises Sakon, calling him a worthy match for Tadakatsu, and that was a really nice touch. Still, For all of its strong character moments, Samurai Warriors 4's version of Sekigahara I felt really lacked gameplay depth. There was still so many officers on the field, like Kiyomasa, Masanori, Takatora, but it all started blending together. It was starting to get really hard to tell the major threats apart from just the filler. But in the end, I do appreciate what this version tried to do, but I can't help but feel like the gameplay just didn't live up to the narrative that it was trying to support. So as we start to wind down this video, normally I'd try to wrap things up with a ranked list of which version of the battle did best, but since this is part one of a two-part project, I'll be holding off on the final verdict until we've covered the Tokugawa side of the conflict as well. But with that being said, I can still share which version of the Western Army's perspective stood out to me the most, and I do believe that that goes to Samurai Warriors 3. Samurai Warriors 2 had the structure and the pace, but the character work was still a little bit all over the place in my opinion. And Samurai Warriors 4 gave us the best version of Mitsunari to date, with beautiful cinematics and great context, but it's the gameplay that let it down for me. Whereas Samurai Warriors 3, I feel like it hit the sweet spot. It may not have the most depth or the flashiest cutscenes, but it delivered on tone, pacing, and mechanics, and that's what's most important for me. The fog system alone added this whole level of immersion that really stuck with me, and it added this sense of desperation that I just found to be incredibly palpable. Mitsunari's motivations were a little bit more balanced here, split between loyalty, duty, and sorrow, and that gave the whole thing more weight for me. So yeah, I'd probably say that Samurai Warriors 3 takes the crown for now, but that does have me wondering, how will the Eastern Army's version stack up? Well, that's what we'll find out in part 2, dropping this Friday, or if you remember, it's already live. If you'd like early access to part 2, as well as access to our members only videos and Discord server, check out the link in the description.